With Angular 2, we divide our page into a tree of subcomponents. Here we have two components. One is a color picker. When the user clicks in one of the color panels, a color is outputted. The other is a color previewer. It's this line saying preview text color. It will adapt the color of the text depending on the color received. Let's then implement these two components. This section here will be the color picker component, so let's replace that with a custom HTML tag. Let's do the same for the color previewer component. And let's give each one a reference. Now, the reference here will point directly to the component instance because the reference is being defined in an element that has a component linked to it. If the reference would have pointed, let's say, to a plain div, it would have referenced the DOM element of the div instead. To implement the reset button, we're going to add a click handler, and inside it we're going to use the color picker reference to call a reset method directly on the color picker component. Let's define the public API of these two components. The color picker component only has an output, which is the color event. It outputs a new color each time the user clicks one of the panels. In the event handler, we're going to use the reference to pass in the color directly to the previewer via $event. $event will contain the new color. As we can see, the syntax for component outputs, like for example the color output event, is exactly the same syntax as, for example, registering click handlers or mouse up event handlers. So it's the same syntax as for native DOM events. So component outputs is a mechanism that allows us to create our own custom events. This is the initial draft for the color picker component. This contains the HTML that we saw before, and via the selector attribute we have linked this component to the color picker custom HTML tag. Using a click handler, we are going to detect when the user clicks one of these two color choosing divs, and when it does so, we are going to output a custom color event with the color that the user just chose. Red and blue are defined on this file, and this is how you define a constant in TypeScript. When the user clicks on a color sample, we're going to call the choseController method, and inside it we're going to emit an output event of type color. So the color is passed in as a string. To that, let's define a color event emitter in the color picker component, and let's annotate it with @output. This identifies this event emitter as a component output. We can then use the color event emitter to emit events like we see here via the emit method and passing in the color. Let's now implement the reset button functionality. Whenever the user clicks reset, we are going to output the color black. The color previewer component has one input, which is the color. Let's define this input by creating a property and annotating it with the @input annotation. We will now apply the color to the color previewer using the ngStyle directive. We are going to go into detail into ngStyle in an upcoming lesson. Let's see these two components in action. So the color picker, if we choose a color by clicking in one of the two divs, we can see that the color is selected and passed on to the color previewer. The reset button is also working. If we click it, the color previewer goes back to black. Notice that color picker and color previewer need to be included in the directives property of the main component, otherwise these components will not be displayed. Let's use the template syntax to pass an input to a component. For example, let's store color in a component variable, and now using the square bracket notation we are gonna pass it on to the color previewer. As we can see, everything still works. Now what we're going to do is we are going to make the color picker component a component that receives both inputs and outputs. The first thing that we need to do is to rename the color event emitter to something like color output, so that it doesn't conflict with the new property color that we're going to introduce. We need to change the @output annotation to say that the name of the event is still color and not color output. Now let's apply to the template the color using ng-style. We can see that now when we click a color sample, not only the color previewer gets the color, but also the title of the color picker. As we can see, the Angular 2 functionality for components is very powerful. With only a very few simple concepts like inputs, outputs, references, we can build well-isolated and reusable components. And more than that, we can reason about how they interact with each other simply by reading the templates where they are being used.